So I'm going to run through sort of what the state of play is currently on a number of these resilience issues. I'll talk a bit about the legislative actions that have taken place. Well, I'll do a little prelude first, and then the budget issues, some of the administrative updates, what kind of regs and things are knocking around, and talk about some of the upcoming action. And unlike Netflix, no, you can't skip the recap by clicking on the thing there. I'm going to give you the recap for the year. So about a year ago, this is the state of play. The 2020 and 21 General Assemblies had put in place the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. It was funded by our membership in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has generated many tens of millions of dollars. Legislation put climate change impacts in permitting for tidal wetlands, Chesapeake Bay Act, septic regs. We had a chief resilience officer created. And at the same time, there were a whole lot of Northam administration administrative actions that were moving ahead. The Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan was underway. This is the master strategy for our coastal region. There was a technical advisory committee in place of way too many people who are experts on coastal policy and science, great group of people. There were executive orders dealing with state buildings and other state actions. And then the administration had also initiated updates to the rainfall estimates for the state, sort of coming out of some of the early work that the city of Virginia Beach did post-Hurricane Matthew, when they looked at the extreme rainfall they got. So at this point, we, Virginia, were probably poised as well as any state in the country that we've looked at in terms of addressing climate change, sea level rise issues. We had policies, we had funding, we had studies underway, we were ready to go. At about that time, the legislature asked the Virginia Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to do a study on the impact of climate change on Virginia's coastal areas. And this was brought about because we had all these programs and policies in place. It was becoming apparent there was a lot of activity that needed to be looked at and coordinated and corralled in the right direction. But also, owing to our Constitution, with a one-term 4-year governor, there was a realization that a lot of these administrative actions were going to expire at the end of the Northam administration term. So they asked VASEM, the Virginia Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine, to do this study. And I think we're going to put a link to it in the chat for those who haven't got a copy. Okay, so basically what it called for was a structure for collaboration and coordination across government. They were asking for a council to govern the state's climate change activities. They pointed out the need to address gaps in policy and procedure. Included in that is the need to reach to the underserved populations in this state with the flood fixes we're talking about. There was a data need, a body to coordinate and support critical data collection. They actually called for a climate change and resilience resource center. And also they took a look at the workforce potential and the potential for economic innovation around some of this work. A little later, the Technical Advisory Committee, which, as I mentioned, is the advisory committee to the Coastal Master Plan, under the leadership of Carl Hirschner, formerly of VIMS, came up with a sort of a punch list of some things that needed to be done going forward. One, make the master plan permanent and update it periodically. Again, the issue of science experts, appoint a TAC to help advise on our climate change work, provide resources for the development and implementation of this work, update the plan with human and natural infrastructure mapped and precipitation included. The Coastal Master Plan was just for the coast and did not include rainfall. And so the next push is to move that study statewide and include rainfall and begin to recognize the natural systems as infrastructure, worthy of protection in their own right. And again, identifying disadvantaged communities. So you can begin to see that the policy points are starting to tighten up here. In November, the Chesapeake Bay Commission issued a study, gaps analysis and recommendations that really flew below everybody's radar. I was not aware of this until well into the legislative process, but it turns out that this was really the roadmap for a lot of the legislative initiatives. And it was not, at least in the resilience community that we're part of, it was never discussed until very far along in the legislative process. And we said, where'd all these bills come from? And they said, well, it came from the Bay Commission report. So the Bay Commission reported the needs as defining state leadership role and coordination, establish a state advisory group for climate resilience, master plan on climate resiliency, dedicated funding, and again, the research and data collection information. So all of these reports were pointing towards some of the policy needs coming into the legislative session. Then we got a new governor, and on December 7th, the first time we heard some definitive stuff about Governor Youngkin's positions, he announced his intention to take Virginia out of RGGI. He followed that up with his first day of executive orders on January 15th. Executive Order number 9 asked DEQ to develop a cost-benefit analysis of RGGI, which was delivered in March, but then develop a series of regulatory moves to begin to take Virginia out of RGGI, out of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So this was the way the table was set when the legislature came in. So again, the key issues: updates and continuation of resilience studies, technical advisory committee. We got to better coordinate all these state programs and policies, and we got to think about funding. We need to think about where the money is coming from in this Community Flood Preparedness Fund, what's going on with RGGI. So these were the main policy issues when the legislature convened. In response to the Chesapeake Bay Commission report, Senator Lewis, who's on the commission, dropped a couple bills in that created the Technical Advisory Committee and codified the master plan and asked for a number of other studies. Those provisions got rolled into the Marsden and Bulova initiatives, SB 551 and HB 516. And that was the omnibus bill that contained most of the provisions in the area of the studies, coordination, funding, TAC, and the rest. And essentially the way it turns out is we've got this daunting series, daunting to DCR, series of reports that are going to be issued. So at the end of this year, DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, is going to provide us with an outreach plan for all of the other actual resilience plans. Beginning July 1st of 2023, next year, we'll get the Commonwealth Resilience Officer, who has not yet been designated, nor do we have a special assistant for flood resilience. Anyway, there'll be a report issued that will evaluate where we are. It's a status report. It'll be due every 2 years. Following that, at the end of 2024, the Virginia Coastal Master Plan update will be produced by DCR. This again is the one that takes the existing master plan, adds precipitation to it, adds a whole lot of other elements that couldn't be dealt with in the rather short period of time with the first plan. And then we're going to get a statewide plan by the end of 2026. And all of this, as I say, is falling on DCR. These are not small undertakings, and it raises the issue. All of those funds that are DCR funds, all of those studies that are DCR studies are going to be paid for out of the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. And so this whole series of studies, some of which, as I say, are fairly expensive, raise the issue about, well, how much money is coming out of the fund? Where's it going? How do we pick these studies of statewide significance? And so the issue of the oversight and reporting on the flood fund was raised in the context of looking at all these studies that we were going to be doing. The governance of the state programs and the governance of the state flood fund, again, was a major issue. The governor's position was that he wanted a single state entity to develop, manage, and integrate coastal restoration and resilience. And in response, Senator Kagan's and Delegate Bloxham introduced the Virginia Resiliency Authority, which incorporated a lot of those elements. Both of those bills died. There was a bill in the House that would have created a Department of Flood Control and a Commonwealth Flood Board, again, a large operation that would have reached across government. That also died. And Senator Lewis came in with a more modest proposal that said, okay, if the fund is within DCR, let's do an oversight board within DCR, and the Soil and Water Conservation Board is suited to provide that additional oversight that's needed. That was passed by both houses, sent to the governor, and then vetoed. And the governor's veto message at the bottom, he again felt that having an oversight board and a coordinating entity in just one agency was not sufficient. He wants it across the government. So he maintained that it might have the unintended consequence of fragmenting our coastal resiliency efforts. So all of that initiative to coordinate state programs and oversee the fund with another entity, all of that died. There was also a push, again, that came out of the Chesapeake Bay Commission report for a revolving loan fund. And Senator Lewis and Delegate Bulova, both of whom are on the Chesapeake Bay Commission, introduced legislation to set up a loan program, but there's also a provision for grants to be made for local governments and a pass-through provision to individual homeowners. One of the complaints about the flood fund is it doesn't reach well through to individuals' private property along the shoreline. So the fund is going to be administered again by DCR with the money coming from the Virginia Resources Authority. And essentially, it's another coastal resilience program. Again, loans and maybe grants. Loans were the main emphasis, but it says these can be grants as well. The priorities are trying to get a couple of local governments to work with each other. The private industry and public O&M, operations and maintenance, I have no idea what that's all about. I must at this point pay homage to Whitney Ketchmark and Ben McFarland from the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission for providing me with a lot of this background, so I didn't have to do it myself. And then finally, $25 million was transferred from the Community Flood Preparedness Fund to this new loan program. And this is my personal editorial here. I have to scratch my head about this because in 2016, the state created a Virginia Shoreline Resiliency Fund, which was a loan fund to basically do resilience work along the shoreline. No money was ever appropriated. In 2020, when we created the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, it was an amendment to this loan program that created a grant program and a loan program. The loan program originally created in 2016 stayed intact. And so we had in 2020, we had a grant loan program. The grants have gone out. The loan program was never implemented with guidelines. We thought that after the second round of the Community Flood Preparedness Fund grants, they were supposed to develop the outlines of the loan program and start making loans, but they never did. So in 2022, we have another funding program that's a loan program. And I must scratch my head as somebody who spent a lot of time in government trying to figure out how we're going to coordinate all this, because we have a grant and loan program, and then we also have a loan and grant program.
Recording in progress.
That is pretty much headed in the same direction. So this area is, and again, we got new legislation here, but it's sort of a head scratcher for me. The Virginia Community Flood Preparedness Fund remains, because we did not pass the legislation for oversight and coordination, remains a problem. And this again is sort of an editorial comment from my days doing government work. The amount of money that's come into the CFPF, the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, to date, which is a year and 3 months, is almost the size of the entire budget for DCR. It's bigger than any single program by far in DCR. And anyone who's done sort of organizational theory knows that when you get growth that's that rapid, it is a major problem for an organization. And so this, I think, is a blinking yellow light. Not that DCR is incompetent or can't handle it, but it's just, this is a major problem for any organization. To date, this has been the progress on the dispersal of that 170 million. Round one was 7.8 million. Grants were made. Contracts are being signed now. Round two, 24.5 million. That was awarded, and the grants are being negotiated now. Round three is for 40 million. Proposals have been made. They were supposed to have been announced a couple weeks ago. In a conversation with DCR staff, they're somewhere in the administration right now. We don't have a delivery date for that. Again, there was a problem, and I'll talk to it briefly in a bit about diversion of money from the Community Flood Preparedness Fund during this last session. $36.5 million was diverted from the fund. 36.4, excuse me. 11.4 million was diverted by Delegate Moorfield to pay for the flood damages in Hurley. Hurley is the town that got flooded out in Buchanan County. And he diverted 11.4 million. And then, as I said, 25 million was diverted to RGGI. So there was a significant diversion of funds, but there's still a large pot of money remaining within DCR. The issue of flood fund oversight and transparency, as I mentioned, is still an issue. Right now, the only report that we have on any of the RGGI funds, including the flood fund, is a requirement that there be an annual report on how those funds are spent. There is a report, oh shoot, I should have had a link to that. There was a report issued last year in the first year. It's not detailed at all. It really doesn't give you the kind of information that you need, nor the kind of information that people were demanding in the first two rounds, which was, what's the scoring? We need to see how these decisions are being made, how the money is being allocated. And those complaints were, again, what led to the push for some oversight entity. In response, on April 26th, Director of DCR Wells sent a letter to Senator Lewis and Delegate Bulova, saying we will adhere to the following transparency principles. And this transparency letter was an attempt to sort of take the steam out, the wind out of the sails of the push to get a Soil and Water Conservation Board. So right now, all we have is this transparency letter from Director Wells. And I will say again, from an editorial perspective, the management direction and oversight of the Community Flood Preparedness Fund and now the Revolving Loan Fund is an issue, because there is no strategic guiding document or plan. I mean, if you look at Virginia, we have a state wildlife plan, we have a state public lands plan, we have plans for everything. We have no plans for this program that's $170 million. You know, there are no metrics for program success. How do we know if we're doing well? You know, what are the three goals we want this program to achieve? There's no guaranteed transparency, just the letter from Director Wells, not to diminish that, but nothing permanent. And no oversight by an independent entity or an arm's length entity, a board, whatever, that a number of people proposed. There's nobody sort of looking at it and going, hey, what's this, what's that, sort of representing the public view. And I think most of all, there's no coordination with other state functions. There's no coordination with what the Department of Transportation might be doing, or Virginia Department of Emergency Management. And so we're in this sort of limbo area right now in terms of a coordinated policy at the state level on resilience. Budget issues, as I mentioned, there were transfers out. I think that the key point is that third paragraph. This funding that's coming into the Community Flood Preparedness Fund out of RGGI is what they call non-reverting money. It doesn't expire at the end of a fiscal year. It's also unappropriated. So I, as a legislator, don't have to go on my hands and knees and beg for either Senate Finance or House Appropriations to give me money. The money shows up. And so it is very, very attractive to divert for other uses. And as we saw in the last session, those 2022 budget amendments signal, to me anyway, that the legislature considers the Community Flood Preparedness Fund as money that can be moved to other things. It's sort of open season on CFPF. And I think that we're going to have to watch out for that going forward. Next up, so that's the legislature. What's up next? Well, the next item is going to be actually the first item on Governor Youngkin's agenda, which was exiting RGGI. And so bear with me a bit here. Governor Northam appointed 2 members to the Air Board. The Air Board controls these regulations. They were never approved by the legislature. So when the legislature convened, as a rule, they usually approve the prior appointees. But these 2 appointees got caught up in the fight over Andrew Wheeler, and Governor Northam's appointees were not appointed, and 2 others were. The Air Board rotates its members. So on June 30, 2 more members come up for appointment, and Governor Youngkin will appoint those. So he now has 4 appointees. And together with a vote or 2 on the existing board, he now has 5 of the 9 votes that he needs to move ahead to repeal the RGGI regulations. He has that emergency regulation prepared as he laid out in Executive Order 9 at the start of the year. He also has a permanent regulation. And the way this will work is at some point after July 1, an emergency regulation will be sent to the board. This short circuits the Administrative Process Act, the normal rulemaking, and the emergency regulation goes into effect, and a permanent regulatory change will also come to the Air Board, and they'll work on that over the next 18 months. While the emergency regulation stays in place. So this would effectively say no more RGGI. On the other side, you can expect that there will be lawsuits filed against this, because the contention is, the governor's contention is that he can change this regulatorily. Others are saying, no, there was a legislative mandate for us to join RGGI. You can only exit RGGI if you get a legislative change. So this will be a big fight going through the summer and fall, and is something to watch out for. Some of the other things that are pending coming up, septic regulations. In 2021, Senator Hashmi enacted legislation that puts climate change in septic regulations. The Virginia Department of Health that administers all the septic regulations said, you know what, it's been 20 some years since we updated these regs. We're going to do the entire regulatory body for septic. So all of the septic regulatory rules for Virginia are now under review. There were 11 working groups that have been meeting informally since winter, looking at the various components of these regulatory changes. The Department of Health will issue a notice of intended rulemaking in late summer, early fall, that will begin the formal regulatory process. And then over the subsequent couple of years, there'll be a complete rewrite of the septic regulations. So anybody who's got septic in their locality, anybody concerned about septic, this is going to be a major, major issue. Again, it hasn't been done for 20 some years. Chesapeake Bay Act, we have regulations that are in place but have been delayed until September 29th of 2024 on living shorelines and putting climate change into the Chesapeake Bay Act. There are guidelines that are being developed to sort of amplify and explain the regulations that should be out by the end of the summer, early fall. So there'll be another point of action or needed information on the Chesapeake Bay Act. The rainfall intensity work, again, the Northam administration started this. They paid for, they got the Chesapeake Bay program to pay for new rainfall estimates for the Bay watershed, and then the state Department of Transportation put money in to do the entire state. We now have updated rainfall estimates. Oh shoot, I should have put that URL in the chat. If you click on that URL, you'll get the map that's hiding behind this graph, and you can click on the geographic points in that map, and you'll get new rainfall curves for your area. The rainfall intensity is up about 18%, which is about what Virginia Beach found in its studies when they hired Dewberry to look at this. And so it's going to be sort of a not significant, but a noticeable increase over the Atlas 14, and I'll explain that little loop right now. So NOAA produces rainfall estimates for each of the areas of the country. It's in a document called Atlas 14. Ours was last done in 2006. It uses rainfall data from the last century. So we're really out of date with our official rainfall estimates. That work that was done to bring the intensity, duration, and frequency, the IDF curves up to date, shows that gap. So Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina have all contracted with NOAA for an update of the rainfall document, Atlas 14. And just to give you an idea, the area in blue is the part of the country where NOAA last did the work in 2006. And you can see that most of the coastal states, with the exception of New Jersey, have asked for an update. Now, when Atlas 14 is changed, and it's going to be, I think they're delivering it in 2024, so it's not going to happen immediately, but it'll happen in a couple of years. By reference, if you look here at 9 BAC 25 and the rest of that, The NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall standards are swept into the regulations by reference, meaning you don't have to go through another regulatory process. So when the Atlas 14 document is published, and if it indeed has about a 18–20% increase in stormwater, rainfall intensity, it will change the design storm for stormwater standards in the state. So everybody in the state will have a bump up in the intensity of their stormwater requirements. And so again, not going to happen this year. It'll be 2024 before we get the data, but just keep this on your radar. So unresolved issues, I'll finish up with this. Funding, we got fights over RGGI. Without RGGI, we're back to where we were before, depending on appropriated funds. There's about 86 million left in the fund if we were in the loan fund and the CFPF if we were to exit RGGI today. So funding going forward is going to be a problem. Coordination of resilience programs and policy, still an issue. All those reports before the session said it was an issue. It's still an issue because the legislature could not and the governor could not come to agreement. And then oversight of the flood fund and now the new revolving loan fund, again, unresolved. Issues before the legislature, a lot of legislation, couldn't get it settled. So essentially, that's in a nutshell what's been going on and what is going on, and I'd be happy to engage in a conversation. And I say conversation because I see people on this call who are much smarter than I am about some of these pieces. So let's just try that.
Skip, could you please show that last slide again with the overall unresolved issues?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
There. So that's sort of where the table's set for the next session of the legislature. Well, actually, we'll start work on that as soon as the governor decides to ask the air board to take us out of RGGI.
So there are two questions that came in previously in the chat. So we'll start with those, and then folks can use the raise hand function and we can call on you, or we can unmute. So the first question is from John Bateman, who's from the Northern Neck Planning District Commission. He asks, why doesn't Virginia apply for BRIC? That's the new FEMA pre-disaster mitigation funding source, BRIC, Building Resilience Infrastructure in Communities. So why doesn't Virginia apply for BRIC funding and match it with the Community Flood Preparedness Fund? Worked for us, he says.
You're the BRIC expert, MC. You tell me. I'm going to throw you that hot potato.
So John, why don't you come off of mute and tell us how you made that match and what the actual mechanics are. We haven't seen, to my knowledge, other communities doing that, and so please go ahead and explain how that worked for y'all. And I also want to know what you mean by Virginia. So do you mean the state in general, or do you mean individual communities like you all are a community as a planning district commission?
Good afternoon. Let me ask the question. Are states eligible to apply for BRIC funding?
Yes, and states do receive BRIC funding for administration of the BRIC grant process currently, and they can apply for resources to do specific capacity building. They are using it for hazard mitigation planning efforts, like the state is currently going through the huge hazard mitigation state update and things of that nature. So yes, they can use BRIC, and technically they can apply to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, but we haven't seen how that has worked in theory, because the fund can fund studies of regional and statewide significance. And so that's kind of been like the entryway for state agencies to tap the resource.
So Virginia has a history of not really tapping into as many federal resources as are available. NIFWIF's a good example. There's a resiliency fund that NIFWIF has, and I don't know why the state of Virginia doesn't, maximize the use of its own fund by applying for federal dollars. So our planning district commission applied to BRIC to update our regional hazard mitigation plan. And we also applied to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund for additional dollars to repurpose that plan also as a resilience planning document. And so we received both sets of funding. And in our conversations with FEMA Region 3, they were very excited about our approach, and they were also expressed excitement about the state coastal resilience master plan and some of the other efforts of the state. So it seems like they would have support from at least FEMA Region 3 staff. I just putting that out there, that the state should think about maximizing its own source of funds with federally available funds.
I think that's really interesting. And I'm glad that you all took that approach. And I'm not sure, why the state, doesn't encourage others to do that, but maybe they will after you all have kind of led the way in doing that.
If we're successful.
Yes, right, of course. And as many of you know on the call, the BRIC program is a nightmare to navigate and has a lot of work that it needs to undergo to make it actually a really truly viable funding source. So a lot of growing pains to get that pre-disaster mitigation funding source on its feet and really usable by communities. We do know that there's some efforts at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management to help kind of underrepresented, underserved, and just resource constrained localities to navigate some hazard mitigation grant bucket program funds, because FEMA's hazard mitigation funds have different buckets. And so they're working with communities on navigating the grant process for another bucket, not necessarily BRIC. And so we hope that this more of a hand-holding approach will be adopted for the BRIC program, which I think is even harder to navigate than the hazard mitigation grant program, which is a post-disaster grant resource. It's only available when the president declares a disaster, and all states are receiving COVID disaster funds through the hazard mitigation grant program. And Virginia has about $51 million available that they've been using towards resilience building, flood resilience specifically. And if others are interested in learning more about that, we can chat about it offline. So John will be pointing to Northern Neck as a case study for how to combine BRIC and community flood preparedness funds.
Bring it on.
Bring it on.
We're getting the bus packed. We'll take a road trip up there. You can explain it to us.
Okay, Chris Stone asked the next question. Anyone know what RCP, which stands for Representative Concentration Pathway, levels the state is looking to reference to account for climate change for both new septic regs and rainfall standards? Do you know the answer to that, Skip?
Do not.
And so what the RCPs actually try to do is capture future trends. So what the concentration of greenhouse gases will be in the atmosphere as human activities change or don't change. And I haven't heard anyone really talking about RCPs. So if anybody wants to unmute or add some thoughts in the chat.
So I'll chime in on one of Chris's questions. The Marissa IDF rainfall data has two options that you can choose when you're using the data. You can look at the low RCP of 4.5 or bump it up to 8.5, but I don't think that either of those are like planned in of which one they're using, but both are available in that data set.
Great.
I think also none of these are going to reach that far into the future. I mean, there'll be upgrades to them probably before. I don't know how far out into the future they're going to reach and whether the difference in the RCP over the next, say, 20 years would make a difference or not. I'd have to think about that. I mean, again, the Atlas 14 gets updated on a normal schedule every 15, 20 years. So anyway,
If the only reason I asked the question is because the code cycle typically can be anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So, we're already looking at maybe 10 years out for some of the codes and standards. And then, over a 20-year period, depending upon what RCP level you assume, it could be significant.
well, it's true. The Atlas 14 changes driven through the design storm process, given the lags in the system, you're right. Because you were just part of that. Wasn't there a recent codes update at the state that you were a part of?
Yeah, but they didn't address this item.
Yeah.
And I know the engineering community right now, we're looking at updating codes and standards, but we already know it's going to be a 10-year cycle. And, if you design a stormwater system, there are stormwater systems like in my neighborhood in Richmond, we're on a combined sewer. And
Yeah.
when you look at concentration of rainfall and overflow potential, I mean, that system is over 120 years old.
Yeah. The septic approach is going to be an interesting one because they're essentially, I'm on the climate change working group. Essentially, where the consensus is moving now is that one would identify sort of high risk areas over the useful life of the septic system, which is call it 30 years. And so you basically, and most of it, nearly all of it is tidal flooding. They're still sort of trying to figure out what the impacts of increased rainfall intensity are on septic failure. Molly Mitchell at VIMS is the expert on this. But at least on the sea level rise piece, the idea would be to identify these areas of higher risk and then impose additional standards on septic in that, shortening the time period, and requiring inspection, requiring different kinds of system, that kind of thing, on new systems or on systems that are being replaced. So some of this, the rainfall stuff is probably not going to affect this round of septic regs, because it's mostly going to be tidally influenced groundwater flooding a system from underneath, or water over land flooding the system from above. And maybe it'll be another 20 years before they update it, who knows? But it's going to be an interesting approach. They're borrowing a concept out of public health called the Hazard Assessment Critical Control Point, or HACCP approach, where you identify the risk and you impose the additional standards on those functions that are taking place in that high risk region in order to control the outcome that you want, which is a functioning septic system.
Another question from John. Can we expect another round of Community Flood Preparedness Fund grant resources?
Like I said, there's still upwards of 60 million, I forget what that slide was. There's $60 million sitting there. You could do another round. The last round was 40 million. It was way oversubscribed. The question is there the political will to do this? Is this the political direction that this administration wants to take? And Madison will eagerly jump into this.
Yeah, our understanding and messaging that we've gotten from the Youngkin administration is that they are after RGGI. They are not after the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. And it is our understanding that if they are successful in removing Virginia out of RGGI, that the Community Flood Preparedness Fund will continue to exist, but they have not identified how they plan on moving revenue into it. So, and they have not outlined that. So we're not sure how that would occur. Like Skip said, there's currently around $64 million left in the fund, but that is not accounting for any money that DCR staff will need to take out. So it could actually be less than that $64 million. But with the numbers that we know concretely, that is how much is left, but it could be a little bit less. But in terms of rounds, what we've heard is that prior to the next round, there will be, the grant manual will be revised. They are required to put out a 30-day public comment on the new grant manual. And so that will be out for 30 days. And then the new cycle will start. And if history proves to repeat itself, usually the awards get announced and then the following day, the new round starts. So once round 3 awards are announced, we're anticipating that round 4 grant manual will at least be announced or dropped within that same week. But once again, this will be the first round that's really done under the Youngkin administration. So there's a lot of unknowns.
And as Madison points out, you've got to reserve monies for these now legislatively mandated studies, both the next coastal master plan and the statewide plan. The last coastal master plan was a $4 million contract, something like that. The next one's going to be more expensive. And to do this statewide, the state is talking about taking a watershed approach and, work. And there's, once you get out of the coastal zone, there's less and less flooding information just because there hasn't been a whole lot of work done in the other parts of the state. So that statewide master plan is going to be a very expensive undertaking. So those 10, 12, $15 million for those studies is going to be have to come out of that. And then as well as Madison points out, there are additional DCR staff that are being hired. So there's a chunk of that that's already sort of allocated.
Next question is from Joseph Curley, back to BRIC. Is the understanding that non-BRIC grant money can be used to meet the local matching fund requirement? So I guess I'll answer this, and I just double check to make sure. So the non-federal or the local match, if the state does not absorb it or cover it, the match can be made in the form of cash, in-kind efforts, or combination. The match cannot be federal funds or funds already used as a match for another federal award. But to my knowledge, state, or I guess private funds could technically be a match. I have not really heard of communities using match to meet that local cost share requirement, but there are many communities on the line that can weigh in if they have done that. Okay, so I guess, and obviously we'll find out if John, is able to use CFPF to meet the match. Okay, so for Kristen Owen with Henrico County floodplain, who is supposed to be on maternity leave, but is still participating in a Zoom, walking her baby in a carriage, has just asked, this is in the weeds, but with the septic regulations update, it would be helpful to clarify floodplain. And I assume she means the definition of floodplain. In her past conversations with Virginia Department of Health about this, they said they use the geologic floodplain and not those that are mapped by the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program on the flood insurance rate maps. She says this is confusing and misleading based on their definition. And Skip, you've been a part of those conversations more than I have, so go for it.
What they're after in looking at flood risk is different from floodwaters damaging septic systems, is different from somebody's structure that FEMA would care about. So the septic systems are both flooding from underneath. So then you've got to understand, is the groundwater tidally connected? Is it not? Is it going to rise as sea level rises? Is it not? Is it in some sort of a catchment area where when you get increased rainfall, it's going to come up? So the floodplain for the purposes of septic is looking at a different endpoint. And it's looking at things like, are these type C soils that do not perk well? Type B soils, okay, the water goes through, no problem. Type C soils, it sits there in a pond and it screws up the septic system. So there's confusion there because they're talking you know, setbacks and flood plains, if you will, but the endpoint for them is different. So I'm not sure how you would reconcile it. I think they're going to identify areas that pose a significant risk to the functioning of a septic system over time. And then those probably will not correspond to where the FEMA floodplain lines are, the X zone, the A, you know, A zone, AE zone. So it is going to be somewhat confusing, but though the FEMA floodplain, I mean, the septic floodplain stuff will only apply to the septic permitting. And I probably should shy away from using the term floodplain because, again, it's a different set of it's a different set of risks and endpoints that they're looking at.
Yeah, I think
And from a hydrogeologic perspective, the floodplain is an area of high water table typically. And it's an area that might be a fluctuating water table too. So in the wintertime, you might have water at the land surface. And then when trees are active and not dormant, you'll have the water table drop. So from that perspective, in terms of siting a septic system where you need about usually 2 feet of separation between the bottom of the septic field and the water table, they probably use it for that reason, use the term floodplain for that reason, right, because it is a floodplain, not just a flood
yeah, so I guess,
zone.
let me clarify. I don't necessarily think they need to use the FEMA floodplain because, Lord, we all know that's not accurate anyway. But I think their definition references the 100-year flood. I haven't looked at it in a while. I think it has something like 24-hour frequency and 100-year. So it's just confusing because FEMA does require localities to regulate septic in the floodplain. And so there was always this kind of like implied notion that VDH would be checking it because I think it says they're prohibited in the floodplain. Obviously they're not prohibited in the 100-year floodplain based on FEMA in a lot of communities. So it just needs to be clarified because that came up with James City County a couple years ago that they were having septics getting put into their FEMA floodplain because it wasn't considered a floodplain for VDH, and it was just really confusing. So I think for septic, there's a whole lot more that they need to consider than what FEMA looks at. It just should be made a little bit easier to understand, I think.
You know, that's a good point, Kristen, and I can't remember that. I am not on all these groups, but I don't know if there is a CFM or even better, an actual operating local government floodplain manager on that group. But I'll mention it. Lance Gregory is the point of contact for all this. I'll mention this to Lance and make sure.
Yeah, and Lance is who I spoke to.
Okay.
It's probably been like 4 years now, so he might not even remember, but he's who I talked to back in the day.
Okay. He's a great guy to work with.
I have a meeting, or excuse me, I have a update that I'm just gonna read really quickly from Kelly Hengler. She says, the Department of Environmental Quality will convene a stakeholder advisory group to assist with development of the 2023 Virginia Handbook. The handbook will, Virginia Stormwater Handbook. The handbook will focus on stormwater management from construction sites and replace the 1988 Chesapeake Bay Local Assistant Manual, at least the stormwater elements of that manual. 1992 Erosion and Sediment Control Handbook, the 1999 Stormwater Management Handbook, and the 2011 and 2013 draft BMP design specifications. It will also incorporate the specifications and standards needed by industries as reflected in approved annual standards and specifications, variances and exceptions, and include current statutes, regulations, technical bulletins, and guidance documents. The handbook will also update the design and maintenance specifications for BMPs, best management practices, and reflect current principles in stormwater management and hydrological science. Members of the stakeholder advisory group will provide direction, guidance, and feedback to DEQ. So that's great. Thank you for that update, Kelly. Okay, and Jessica said, will you please share that list in an email? I assume that's what you mean. That, okay, we got
I
it.
already put it in the chat, yeah. And
Okay.
then-
Thanks, y'all.
Yep, and then Chris above that had a quick FYI to MC if you want me to read it.
About the, yes. Chris Stone says that the next meeting of the joint subcommittee on flooding is scheduled for Monday, July 18th at 1 p.m. at the Brock Center in Virginia Beach. That's the Chesapeake Bay Foundation site. The meeting is open to the public, and there's a good chance to bring up potential legislation for the 2023 General Assembly. So Chris, we're unsure about whether or not, no, there is no virtual option. Okay, so please come in person.
Is there any way we can get them to provide it virtually, Chris? Even if, what if we have the equipment that y'all could do that with, if you wanted to borrow it, would that be?
CBF has it at Brock
Brock
as
Center
well.
has it.
Yeah,
It's
so would that,
illegal. This is
I mean,
Pam Mason. They can't do it legally.
Legally.
Yeah. I don't think so.
Since the General Assembly didn't extend the allowance for
Oh,
public
that's
bodies to
right.
meet. That's
Are
why.
This is Wendy. I'm with the Department of Historic Resources. We have been doing a hybrid option where we meet in person, but we also have a virtual component. So we're complying with the public meeting requirements, but we do also have the virtual component. So I think it can be done. At least that's what we've been doing. So, but the meeting itself and the board members and everything are in person at the meeting site, but we stream the meeting, and then some members of the public offer public comment through the virtual option as well as in person, just as an FYI.
Wendy, this is Jessica Steelman with the ANPDC. That's been our understanding too thus far, that the business can't be conducted virtually or a quorum, but that you can still have a virtual option to listen in or comment.
Right, that's exactly what we've been doing.
Well, I will reach out to Senator Lewis's staff and see if you're planning on do that. But I know Senator Lewis is opposed to having a virtual and even hybrid option.
okay. If you need any support from us on that, Chris, please let us know.
Okay.
Right, here's the hack. I'll stand there with my iPhone, do Facebook Live. You all can text me with your questions and I will ask them from the audience. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds exactly right.
I mean,
Perfect.
come on, what is the deal here?
Yeah, let's do that.
Vote for Skip.
You gotta clap.
Oh my gosh.
All right, so no other questions in the chat. So does anybody have a question they want to ask? Come off mute. Do it. We have time for one more question.
And then Skip, I think you also had a slide you wanted to share at the end of your presentation with some links, maybe?
Oh, no, you put the links in the chat.
Oh, I thought there was another slide after.
Oh,
your-
no.
Sorry.
One thing that we would like to hear from others is about additional subject matter for these lunch and learns. We have several upcoming, one that will focus on Virginia's living shorelines. We have a staff member who's been doing an incredible survey of living shorelines in Virginia over the past, is it 2 years? Permits, excuse me, living shoreline permits that we're going to be presenting on through a lunch and learn. We also would like to present on the staggering numbers of tidal wetlands loss projected with sea level rise, doing that in coordination with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. We have a long list of things that we're interested in presenting on, but this is a successful forum because it's focusing on things that our partners and our friends want to learn about as well. So feel free to add some stuff in the chat. You can always follow up with us at any point and email. And there's a request from Isabella O'Brien to resend the links in the chat. We can definitely do that. And on our website for all of our recorded lunch and learns, we can add chats, we can add links for each topic under the videos, and we will do that. And of course, the presentation slides will have links where they're referenced and in the PDF version, so you can access them that way as well.
And Kelly wanted to know if there's a link to the VDH process. There is not. There are notices of every one of these meetings on the town hall function. It's really right now in a very informal process. I'll see if I can find where they're down, all of these groups, all 11 groups are down to their last meeting. And then when the formal process is engaged, there'll be lots of notices about it, but I can't remember seeing anything written. Kelly, I'll look around, and if I find something, I'll send it your way.
Great. Is there any other topic suggestions like MC asked for lunch and learns? You can unmute or put them in the chat for us.
Not 1 o'clock.
Will Wetlands Watch be invited to discussion re Wetlands Watch factor in the blue crab low count? Does anyone know that? From our side.
Are we invited?
So stupid.
Sounds like we haven't heard, we didn't get an invitation.
Kelly, go ahead. I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi, Skip. I'm not the best at texting questions. So, you know, the Chesapeake Bay Journal came out just this morning with VMRC determination on lowering the commercial as well as recreational catch because of the low numbers that came out on the blue crab populations. So I saw a whole list, of course, all the pertinent entities who are coming together to go over a very complex issue about the third year in a row, 33-year record low, with the blue crab population. And I kept seeing the word, of course, wetlands and marsh, and I thought of you. So if you're not aware of that Chesapeake Bay Journal, I'll try to throw it in the chat. And VMRC reducing the commercial and recreational. That means just anyone going out there to get their own crabs. And that's going to be effective pretty quick. So, and it'll go into next year's crab season as well. So I know Wetlands Watch is such an advocate, and I just want to be sure that you had your eyes and ears on that because of the marsh loss effect, and I appreciate you. That was basically it.
Thank you, Kelly.
Oh yeah, I see my copy here. I'll take a look at that.
Yeah, we're aware of the Chesapeake Bay Journal. MC's been included in it a couple times.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Cool. I think MC, did you have something? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Nope, we're good. So we'll send a message around with the recording. We'll post the video on our website. And if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot them to Skip or one of us.